Welcome to Computer History with Chris Garcia. I am, in fact, Chris Garcia. Today we're looking at a bunch of dwarves. By the early 1960s, IBM was clearly the leader in the world of computing. They had a massive lead over every other computer company in the US, so much so that they topped all other companies combined in market share. There were good reasons for this, notably the fact that they had already been the leaders in the world of punch card accounting. So as the saying goes, no one ever got fired for buying IBM products. Like IBM, the companies that managed to carve out an area for themselves in an arena they were never going to dominate, most of the companies that were selling computers in the 1960s were founded for other purposes that gave them an in to make computers and to sell to the people who were looking to buy them. There were two names for the group, and we're going to be jumping back and forth a lot this episode, so prepare for conceptual whiplash. But there was The Bunch, and there was Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. The reason for this I'll explain later. Some did very innovative machines that had a lasting impact, and some just kind of rode coattails. Let's start with looking at the Seven Dwarves. Burroughs was one of the most important companies in American business from the 1890s through the middle of the 20th century. They were the providers of mechanical calculators and other early accounting equipment. They did a series of mechanical ledger machines and later electrical mechanical ledger machines, which were sort of meant to bridge the gap for Burroughs while IBM was figuring out how to make electronic computer systems that were small enough and cheap enough for smaller companies. Burroughs' first computers were interesting as they had purchased Electrodata Corporation in 1956. Electrodata was actually the third largest computer seller at the time, behind only IBM and Remington Rand Univac. The Datatron 205 was the last Electrodata machine, but Burroughs continued the process and sold the Datatron 220, its last general-purpose vacuum tube machine. The 220 managed to get 42 in operation by 1961. Burroughs also produced a lot of sort of niche machines that were use-specific, things like industrial control systems such as the D103, even a signal processor that was used with Sage, also missile guidance computers. They made a lot of money on special-purpose machines, and they were in the computing game from the start. Burroughs also did machines that sort of bridged the gap between their electromechanical ledger machines and the computers with the E101, which was sort of a desk-sized machine based on tubes and diodes. It was clearly competing with the LGP30 and the Bendix G13 as a single-user machine. It was really the B5000 that gave them a stronghold into computing, and they were the number 2 for much of the 1960s to IBM. The first machine in the line of mainframes of B5000 used diodes and transistors, and it was a good seller, and it spawned a long line of systems throughout the 60s and 70s, passing through the transistor to the IC era, and its descendants all the way to the current day through the B6500 design. They also released a series of medium-sized systems, notably the B2500, which was half of a B5000, as an old programmer joked to me once, that were designed as COBOL machines for use in business. They also got into the small systems in the late 60s with the B1000, 1/5 of a B5000. This is an interesting feature that some users were absolutely thrilled with. It had a writable control store. Now, the master control program, the MCP for you Tron fans, would schedule a job to run and then load an interpreter that would allow it to run any specified language required. This was incredibly useful. It allowed the machine to emulate, theoretically, other machines. And as the line continued, it was an important part of the sales pitch for it. In 1986, Sperry and Burroughs merged. They formed Unisys, which is still around today. Speaking of Sperry, in a roundabout way, Univac was the first name for computer to the general public, and the Univac 1 was the most important commercial machine in bringing the computer to the minds of the masses. It was originally designed by the Eckert-Mauchly Corporation, but they sold to Remington Rand in 1951 before the Univac 1 was actually introduced. Remington Rand had been a manufacturer of typewriters, which was certainly an entry into the world of office devices. They also made impressive guns and later electric shavers. Remington Rand made a run as a big dog behind only IBM in the 1950s, and they released a number of mainframes through the 50s and 60s. After they bought Electronic Research Associates, they even branched into supercomputers. They sold their computer division to Sperry, which became Sperry Rand, and that became a huge seller of embedded system as well as some general purpose system. They were around, but they eventually merged with Sperry to form Unisys. National Cash Register, or NCR, is one of the most important players in a number of areas of American retail culture. They started out as a cash register company, and they still make cash registers and associated equipment to this very day. They acquired Computer Research Corp in 1953, fairly early in the scheme of things as computers go. And they ended up releasing their first electronic device, a magstripe system called the Class 29 Postronic. Love that name. They followed that in 1957 with a co-developed transistor computer, created in conjunction with General Electric, the RCA 304. Now, this was the first of a line of computers in the 300-3000 series that they made over the years. And they had a major foothold in banking, largely because they developed MICR, or MICR, I can never remember how it's pronounced, magnetic ink character recognition. It's that string of weirdly shaped numbers at the bottom of your checks. They also went on to develop scanners and systems to interact with UPC codes. Now, they were making computers throughout the 60s through the 80s, and they were acquired by AT&T in 1991, though the NCR name survived through 1998, and though they're still around today doing some things, making cash registers and ATM, they actually ended up killing off their computing division, which had been sold a couple of times in 1998. Control data will be covered in more depth over a couple of episodes, but they were sort of the odd man out on this list. They were best known as a supercomputer manufacturer. Now, they started off as a group within ERA, which had, again, been purchased by Remington Rand Univac. But once they were purchased by Sperry, things became a little too civilized, and they started to stand in the way of the innovation path. So a group of them spun off and formed Control Data Corporation, with William Norris as the CEO. Their principal designer, though, was Seymour Cray. Now, they released the 1604, an early transistorized mainframe in 1960, and the front end of it was eventually spun off as a standalone machine, the CDC 160A, which I always thought they just did because if you erased one of the legs of the A, it became 1604. They released a number of high-speed peripherals, but it was really when they released the CDC 6600, the fastest machine in the world, that things really turned around. It redefined supercomputing, and while Univac had the Lark and there were IBM machines like Stretch that were big players in the supercomputing world, everybody wanted the 6600. This is the fastest machine in the world until it was surpassed by its successor, the CDC 7600, which was also designed by Seymour Cray. IBM was actually scared of this, and they announced a Series 360 machine that was exactly as fast as the 7600, although they had no actual intention of offering the machine. And this led to a lawsuit where CDC won like $80 million or something like that, and more importantly, had IBM Service Bureau Corporation turned over to them. The 7600 was the fastest in the world from 1969 through 1976, when it was replaced on that list by Seymour Cray's new company, Cray Computing, and their Cray 1 supercomputer. CDC also did the Star and Cyber systems, and had a lot of very interesting systems there, doing networking of various sorts. The Plato system, which I'll talk about much later down the line, was actually running on them. Now, they would be around in various ways through 1999, but they really were just broken up and became defunct. We'll hear a lot more about them in the supercomputing era's episodes that I'll be doing later. Honeywell had been around for a good long while, and they started doing heater and various manufacturing things, but they got into control systems and aeronautics in the 1940s. Now, they did their first computer, a co-development with Raytheon, in 1957, and that was the Datamatic 1000. Now, eventually they bought out Raytheon and just founded Honeywell Information Systems that ended up selling the machines. They started a line of mini computers, most of them ending in 16. So you had the 316, the 116, the 316, the 516. I think they went through the 716, but I'm not 100% sure on that. And that was all because they were 16-bit machines. Now, Honeywell bought GE's computer business in 1970, but just as important was their acquisition of Xerox Data Systems, which had actually bought Sigma Data Systems, which did very robust mainframes. Now, Honeywell Information Systems would be purchased by Group Bull, itself a merger between Bull from France and NEC from Japan, and they'd be around for a while, but by 1991, Honeywell was out of computing. They'll still see plenty of Honeywell stuff today, from security systems to water and electricity meters. General Electric and RCA we talked about a little in a previous episode, and they were of the seven dwarves, but they were not of the bunch. as the group of competitors were known by the late 1970s. Now, the reason for that was GE sold their computer division to Honeywell in 1970, slightly ahead of RCA's release of the Spectra 70 system. But the thing is, RCA's board didn't want to continue the brand, so they sold to Sperry, who discontinued the line because it was a lot like their 9000 series computers. What they were really after was RCA's customer base. And since they had very similar computer systems themselves, it made a natural fit. It's funny that RCA as a whole was eventually sold to General Electric. So the Seven Dwarves and Bunch all had a lot to tell us. Some of the innovations that came out of these smaller companies, which were usually parts of bigger companies, were really impressive, with CDC leading the pack as far as innovation goes. The fact that they had to separate themselves from IBM in some way made their innovations often unique, such as NCR's CRAM storage system, a very important automated magnetic storage system. They also had interesting machines, but it was clear that they couldn't fight IBM. So they all either had to tag along, like RCA, or just be weird enough to gain a following. Thanks for listening to Computer History with Chris Garcia. Next time, it's DEC, from the start to the PDP-8, and then it might be time for the computer languages episode I've been promising. But I'm not promising that. So thanks for listening. I'm Chris.